Hello and welcome back to All About Russia. My name is Andrew, and in this video we're going to be looking at the indigenous community of the Crimean Peninsula, the Crimean Tatars. The Crimean Tatars are the titular nation of the Crimean Republic. As of the last Russian census, there are over 250,000 Crimean Tatars in the entire Russian Federation, with the largest community in Crimea itself. Outside of the Crimean Republic, significant Tatar communities can be found in the federal cities of Sevastopol and St. Petersburg. Crimean Tatars are also numerous abroad, for reasons that we will discuss later in this video. Significant communities exist in Romania, Uzbekistan, and Turkey. The Crimean population of Ukraine is heavily disputed, with an estimated 25,000 on the Ukrainian mainland, but that figure being much higher if we include Crimea in Republic. Their self-identifying title, Crimean Tatars, identify them both as a Turkic people and indigenous to Crimea. Some members of this community drop the Tatar title entirely, simply identifying as Crimeans. This is because the ancestry of the Crimean Tatars is not just Tatar. As we have explored in our video on the Crimean Republic, many ethnic groups have resided in the Crimean Peninsula, and the pedigree of those people draw from multiple sources. This can actually be reflected somewhat in their sub-ethos groups. In addition to the more general Crimean Tatar identity, the Yalibolu, or coastals, exist. This sub-ethnic group claim an ancestry from the Genoan, Byzantine and Gothic peoples who inhabited the southern part of the peninsula. Tats, not to be confused with the Iranian-speaking people of the same name, are Highlanders, who traditionally lived in the mountainous regions of Crimea. These people are thought to be descendants of those driven into the mountains, notably the Cumans. The Nogai are another sub-ethnic group, historically connected to the Nogai people of Dagestan, who adopted Crimean language and customs and historically roamed in the steppeland of the north. Unusually, the Crimean Tatar identity also applies to the Roma. The Ayuji are Roma people who adopted Crimean language and culture during their migration into Europe, and are as such included as part of the wider Crimean Tatar people. Historically, other ethnic groups, such as the Karaite Jews and Pontic Greeks, did live in Crimea for very long periods of time. I have, however, not included them in the Crimean Tatar people, as there are enough differences to note that they are their own separate ethnic group. In addition to having separate peoples, there is arguably not one Crimean Tatar language, but rather three. Whilst all are Turkic in origin, they do not come from the same branch of Turkic, and thus significant differences do exist. The standard dialect for both writing and speaking is the Middle dialect. This is the dialect used by the Tat people, and is from the Kipchak branch of the Turkic language family tree. Additionally, the Southern dialect does exist, which is popular among the Yalibolu community and is thought to have derived from Ottoman influence and is therefore in the Ogug branch. The Northern dialect is heavily influenced by the Nogai language and holds a weird juxtaposition of being one of the least spoken dialects in Crimea, but one of the most widely spoken ones abroad. This is a direct legacy of the expulsions and immigration throughout Crimean history. As mentioned earlier, the Middle dialect is the dialect used for reading and writing. Crimean Tatars use a Cyrillic alphabet to do this with. Originally, the Crimean Tatars had no written language, and it was only in the 16th century that an Arabic-based script was adopted. In large part due to the regular Ottoman bureaucracy they were regularly encountering. In 1876, Ismail Gasprinsky created a unified form for the three dialects in an Arabic script. This was done to improve education and cohesion among the Crimean Tatars while still linking them to their Ottoman overlords. This script was used right up until 1928, but it is worth noting that after 1850 in the Crimean War, the need for Crimean Tatars to write fell dramatically. In 1928, a Latin script was adopted, as was the case for many minority languages in the Soviet Union, before being replaced by a Cyrillic one in 1938. This has been the script used ever since, and is notable for having 4 new diphthongs that do not exist in the Russian language. Many people cite the beginnings of the Crimean Tatar people as the arrival of the Mongols in the 13th century. But this is not wholly true. As we have touched upon in previous videos, Many people have lived in the Crimean Peninsula over the millennia, and many of these people have left both an archaeological as well as genetic mark. Two people that may be considered the forerunners of the Crimean Tatars are both the Cumans and the Byzantines. The Cumans had arrived in Crimea in the 11th century and had populated the northern steppe regions, raising livestock and living across the vast region. These were a Turkic people who would be conquered during the Mongol invasion, but continued to exist in small communities. Some of these would go on to integrate well with the invaders and formed a significant block of Tatar power in Crimea later on. The Byzantines may seem an unusual choice of ancestry, but their dominance of the southern coast and the establishment of profitable institutions such as vineyards and slavery made them integral to the Crimean Tatar story. Without the legacy of the Byzantines, the core foundation that united many of the Crimean Tatars together and allowed their state to exist for centuries united would not exist. We will explore these themes later in the video, but for now it's important to bear in mind that when the Mongols did arrive in 1238, they did not find a wasteland, rather a skeleton of a state, ripe and ready to be developed. Establishing the regional Ulus capital at Solkhat, Stari Krim as we now call it, many Tatars began to take up the herds and land captured from the Cumans, and assumed overlordship of the southern coastal cities. This was not unusual for the Mongols, as they had settled in much of the steppe land they had conquered, but the relationship with the southern cities would prove to be an important one. In return for tithes and gifts, both in gold and silver, but also in luxury items such as silk, the southern cities were permitted to export slaves across the Black Sea to the rich Byzantine and Arab states. This relationship put the Tatars at the top of society. Over time, to ensure the funds kept flowing, the local beys would send out their men to get slaves from the subjugated peoples, even raiding their neighbours if need be. By 1300, Kaffa, a port city leased to the Genoese, was providing the Khan of the Golden Horde huge profits from slavery. These were of course being skimmed off by the local beys to elevate their own position as well. Those Cuman communities that had submitted to the conquest now began to integrate into this pyramid, selling their services to local beys in return for land and grazing rights. The Cumans had held the steppe, and now the Tatars did, both working at the behest of the Mongols. In 1313, the Khan of the Golden Horde, Uzbek Khan, declared Islam the religion of his state, and sent imams out to convert his vassals and the populace at large. The tribes of the Crimean Ulus were quick to adopt Islam and continued to traffic subject peoples to the port of Kaffa, where foreign subjects would sell them on for a profit. It's not entirely clear why Islam was so readily accepted among the Crimean Tatars. This conversion may have been a slow process or a very quick one. There was evidence to support both ideas. What we do know is that at least on a nominal level, the Crimean Tatars accepted Islam and continued as they had before, trading and slaving to increase their own power. Whilst Crimea was not a monolith, the prestige of Crimean Tatars began to filter and change the people below them, notably via their language. Much as had been the case under the Tatar yoke in the Russian principalities, the Crimean Tatar language became a prestige language and was adopted by many of the communities in Crimea. Whilst Byzantines and Cumans and other people had been in Crimea before this, when the Tatars arrived in 1238, they served as vassals of the Mongols. But by the late 14th century, these Mongol demands on their manpower for constant wars and uprisings had made the overlords seem weak, and the ambitious beys of Crimea began to plot their independence. The Crimean Tatars were not unique in doing this. The beys of Kazan, Uzbek and Nogai had similar thoughts, and in 1420 the Crimean Tatar clans requested a Genghis. Hasigarai, in exile in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, agreed and led the Crimean clans in revolt for over 20 years as their Khan. Independence was agreed in 1441 after much fighting, but Hasigarai would fight for 8 more years before securing his position at the top of the Crimean clan system. The Crimean Khanate would remain a power for centuries. Supported by a rich slave trade, the numerous Crimeans would regularly raid to the north, east and west for cargo to ship south. These profits would enrich the Khan, who, in turn, would enrich his beys, and ensure the dominant military elite of Crimea remained cohesive and united behind the Garay clan. The Byzantine Empire had fallen in 1453, but a rump state had existed in Crimea as the Trebizond Principality. The Crimean Tatars had traded slaves with the Byzantines for a long time, but quickly moved on to their replacements, the Ottomans. Arriving in Crimea to conquer the Trebizond Principality, the Crimean Tatar nobility was soon put under the thumb of these newcomers, supposedly for failing to honour an alliance to conquer those of Trebizond. The resident Khan, Mengli Garay, was held as a guest in Istanbul for several years before being released on condition of fealty. In reality, the Crimean clans were actually not opposed to working with the Ottomans. After all, they were their best customers, sharing a religion, linguistic links, as well as an economic incentive. The Ottoman-Crimean relationship was more one of a working partnership than a true lord-vassal relationship. This was in part due to the massive distance between them. An entire sea separated the Crimean Tatars and the Ottomans. Yet with this arrangement, the Crimean Tatars grew year on year and went from strength to strength. It is hard to say exactly when Crimean Tatar emerged as an identity. After all, the blending and mixing of the peoples of Crimea had taken a very long time. One estimate puts it around the year 1500, and for good reason. Conquering the remnant of the Great Horde in 1502, a change in security and thus mentality was evident across the clans. Traditionally, the fortress of Kirkyur was the residence of the Khan, having been adopted after the independence from the Golden Horde. But in 1532, a new location was decided on, a location with gardens and harems and a splendid palace in which to entertain guests, Bakhchisarai. The wealth of the slave trade made the Khans rich, and this allowed them to spend on cultural pursuits such as art, poetry and architecture. The horsemen of Crimea would ride across Eastern Europe, bringing thousands of Slavs to the slave markets in Kaffa. The terror of the Crimean Tatars raiding lands around them made them seem invincible, but it also made their own peninsula seem an oasis of peace. Crimean Tatar society was a very interesting one. Slavic slaves farmed and tilled the soil, while Greeks and Jews, many who converted to Islam for ease of life, traded abroad. Yet at the very top was the Khan, and the Khan took all. This flow of money made cohesions between the clans incredibly strong. This was so much so that as the neighbouring Nogai horde expanded, not only were the Crimeans able to band together and defeat them, but they also made a splinter horde, the lesser Nogai horde, their vassals on the Kuban River. Some of these vassal Nogai horsemen would relocate to the northern Crimean Peninsula, where their descendants live today. Even distant Muscovy and Lithuania paid irregular tribute to avoid brutal raids that decimated their lands. For the Crimean Tatars, the 16th century was a golden age, an age of art, an age of beauty, an age of wealth, but especially an age of peace and stability for them. The fortunes of the Crimean Tatars began to truly change in the 18th century. Having grown strong under Ottoman protection, Ottoman defeat and subsequent signing of the Treaty of Karlovitz caused a major rift for the Crimean clans. Having assisted the Turks consistently on campaign, this treaty was something of a slap in the face, for the simple reason that it forbid the Crimean Tatars from raiding. Crimean society, much like that of the Barbary states of North Africa, was a slave-holding society, where a slave-holding elite held most of the power. Without slaves, this class did not have any wealth, and without wealth, there could be no cohesion within the Crimean clans. This in turn meant the ambitious Crimean clans would not work with the Khan, and that made them vulnerable. What's more, Crimean security was dependent on Ottoman success, and when the Ottomans began to lose, it also meant that their own frontier became vulnerable. Whilst the Treaty of Karlovitz was just that, a treaty, it stands as a watershed moment for the Crimean Tatars, a point where their society was about to undergo a dramatic change in fortunes. The Crimean Tatars would breach the treaty 2 years later, though with diminished returns. Since the 16th century, Russia had built a series of forts and barricades to prevent the Tatars abducting their people. Populated by equally skilled Cossack horsemen, slave demand began to drift to the Caucasus, which caused another problem. Since the 16th century, at the behest of the Caliph in Istanbul, the Crimean Tatars had sent imams to the peoples of the Caucasus, especially the Circassians. What this meant was that a potential source of slaves were now Muslim and thus off limits. At least on paper. Economic incentive often overrides religious dogma, and the enslavement of both Circassian men and women continued unabated. As their attention drifted more towards the Caucasus, a greater demand was put on the Circassian people. The Circassian slave trade is a fascinating topic, and other YouTubers have done a tremendous job in explaining the intricacies of it, so I shan't do that here. What I will say is the Circassian slave trade was something that had existed for a long time in relation to the Crimean Khanate, but it was only after the Treaty of Karlovitz when suddenly the demand for Circassian slaves increased quite a lot. The Kabylian princes of the Adigya had paid a sum to the Caliph to avoid such enslavement, yet the cash-strapped Crimeans ignored this. The result was an escalation that saw a combined Crimean Ottoman force crushed in the Caucasus by Adigya warriors, and the end of Crimean overlordship in the Kaban region. Desperate for slaves to continue their lifestyle, the Crimeans once again began to try raiding northward, in direct breach of the Treaty of Karlovitz. Whilst not immediately punished, due to other things going on at that time, these raids were not ignored, and in 1735, this issue came home to roost. An enormous Russian army was marched into Crimea. This was something of a rude awakening for the Tatar clans, as they had been used to attacking rather than being attacked. The lack of funds and success in war had transferred not only into financial chaos, but a lack of suitable firearms, and the Russians would march deep into Crimea, burning down the Bachchatsarai Palace in 1736. After this, the Russians would leave, but primarily due to plague in the region, not a united Crimean assault. This lack of power by the Khan saw infighting. Different clans would clash with the Khanate, and frequently change who the Khan was as their powers rose and fell. The second half of the 18th century saw a dramatic change in the relationship between the Crimean Khans and the Ottoman Caliph. Due to perceived instability and weakness, the Khan of Crimea was frequently changed, both by the Caliph in Istanbul, but also by the clans themselves, who would fight each other to put their nominee on the throne. The Ottomans, in turn, would use their appointee to call Crimean clans to fight for them against Persia with little compensation. This highlighted both the recklessness of the Crimean clans, but also their dependence on the Ottoman Empire. 1768 saw war break out between the Ottomans and Russia, with the Crimean Peninsula largely being their battleground. Crimean villages were burnt, and a population devastated as the superior Russian forces marched deep into the peninsula. The conflict was a thorough Russian victory, and the Crimeans were dealt a harsh blow. Under the terms of peace, they were removed from Ottoman protection and established as an independent entity. Whilst on the surface that may not seem such a dire fate, there are two things to consider. Firstly, the Ottoman Sultan wasn't just the head of state, he was the Caliph, the religious leader of all Muslims. And he had just been told he could not help the Crimeans in any conflict. Secondly, the Crimean Tatar society was built around slaves, gaining slaves and selling them. Slavery they had been able to commit under Ottoman protection. Protection that was now gone. The Crimeans were left with a stark choice. Continue as they had, with a way of life they knew and inevitably face the eager Russian Empire again, or adapt and change for the modern world. The mood in Crimea was clear. That same year in 1774, Devlet Garai rode across the Kaban to seize the throne, with great support from the conservative Crimean clans. Consolidating control, he sent emissaries to the Ottoman Caliph, asking for them to once more embrace the Khanate into their realm. The Ottoman reply, deafening silence. Whilst the Crimean Tatars made fantastic cavalry and had served as brilliant function for the Ottomans when expanding, in their fragile and delicate state, the Crimean Tatars were simply too wild, too eager to continue the old ways. Europe was no longer their hunting ground, and eager imperialist eyes fell on the rich Crimean soil. 3 years later, Devlet Garai was ousted by Sahib Garai, backed by a Russian army. The Crimean clans had been divided under Devlet, and the diminished slave trade returns led to the Beys to begin to look to each other for gain. Thus few wept for Devlet's passing. Trade concessions, freeing of slaves, and Russian troop basings were all provided by this last Khan of the Crimeans, something that almost immediately put him at odds with both the nobility and populace at large. Sahib attempted to modernise Crimea, to move away from the Islamic past and toward an enlightened future, but the people were not ready for it. In 1778, a large revolt broke out against them. His own Russian trained troops defected and, at a loss, appealed to his true overlords, the Russians. We touched on this issue during our video on the Crimean Republic, so we won't go into great detail about the annexation. What we will focus on is the effect it had on the Crimean Tatar population. In their social structure, Tatars held the top position, but relied on both middlemen and a vast slave class to support that. When the Russians became involved in the region, one of their first acts was to chip away at this slave underclass, freeing many and preventing more being captured. Similarly, the removal of the Greek population, who were integral to the slave trade, out of Crimea helped disrupt this part of Crimean society. Both the Greek and Jewish communities were removed from southern Crimea and relocated in the Novorossiya region. This was done to disrupt the slave trade ever further, in which both communities had acted as middlemen. This in turn disrupted the ability for the Khan and the beys below him to gain any capital and mount any real resistance. In 1793, 89% of Crimea was populated by Crimean Tatars, but 100 years later this had dropped to just over 40%. And this decline happened for a number of reasons. Firstly, the flight of the Crimeans did not end when the Khanate fell. As disease came and Russian penal laws were implemented, more and more Crimeans opted to leave for more accepting lands of the Caliph. With no leadership to rally them, entire clans migrated, leaving empty villages and untended farms. The fallout of the Crimean War likewise saw many Crimean Tatars emigrate for fear of their lives, many being accused of being a fifth column for the Turks on both the local and government level. The attraction of Crimea appealed to both Russians of high and lower standing. The warm water port of Sevastopol saw thousands of soldiers relocate to the port city, bringing their wives and children with them. Officers and generals, princes and industrialists all relocated to Crimea and brought their servants, slaves and workers with them. Likewise, the emancipation of serfs in 1861 saw a tidal wave of settlers move to Crimea, attracted to the rich Crimean soil where vineyards and farms were well established. The rail connection of 1873 sped this process up, and by the end of the century, the Crimean Tatars were now a minority in their own lands. This sudden change in both position and demographics caused unease and uncertainty amongst the Crimean Tatar population. Many sought answers about why and how this had happened to them. While some preferred the old system of Ottoman patronage, a new thought, Jadism, began to be preached. It advocated a modernization of the Crimean people, embracing the new technologies and institutions of their enemies. Those who followed this philosophy learned to read and write in Russian, learning to operate the machinery used by the state as well as integrate into Russian society. An interesting side note is with the fall of the Khanate, an interesting change happened to the Crimean Tatars as well. Whereas before many Crimean Tatars had been urban or lived in nearby townships, after so many years of emigration and Russian rule, those who remained often lived in villages outside the traditional fortified encampments and palaces in the east and south. At the start of the 20th century, the Crimean Tatars were a remnant of what they had once been. No longer independent slaveholders, they were reduced to the status of another subservient Muslim population in this large multi-ethnic empire. An empire that had made castles made of sand. When the First World War broke out, the Crimeans were excluded from the draft, not being trusted as potential fifth columnists. What this meant is that for a substantial part of the conflict, their population was largely unaffected. By March 1917, conversations were being had loudly about the position of Crimean Tatars in the new Russian Republic. Working with the new institution, Tsarist restrictions began to be lifted in the realms of education and travel. With the unrest in Russia and the revolution of the Bolsheviks, mayhem arose throughout the former empire, and nowhere more so than in Crimea. The Crimea of the early 20th century was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious place, with competing philosophies and ideas. With the first stirrings of civil war, the Crimean Tatars assembled and their intelligentsia, who were largely Jihadists, formed a Crimea People's Republic in October 1917. Throughout the Civil War, the Crimean Peninsula would change hands several times. In turn, the Crimean Tatars would be elevated to both leadership and discriminated against. We have explored this extensively in our video on the Crimean Republic, so I shan't be exploring the timeline here. Instead, what I will be focusing on is how these many changes affected the Crimean Tatars themselves. Both the German invasion and the eventual Bolshevik victory saw the Crimean Tatars promoted to positions of governance and as support for the Crimean Tatar language, as well as education in general. This indigenization was a state objective, and often paired officials with a Soviet-Slavic counterpart for equality and control. This was to ensure peace between the multi-ethnic communities of Crimea, which was paramount for the Soviet leadership, and growth was seen after the war years. By 1932, half of the Crimean Executive Committee were ethnic Crimean Tatars, an unusually high amount for that time. However, during the Civil War, a number of atrocities, both committed by the Crimeans and to them, were reported, and the degree of hostility in Crimea was evident for a long time afterwards. The Crimean Tatars were restricted in their movements, and the Soviet requisitions caused untold harm to this community, as many as 100,000 Crimean Tatars dying during the Civil War years. The religious history of the Crimean Tatars was targeted by the Soviet state, and numerous mosques were destroyed, shattering a link that dated back to the 14th century. The momentum of the Soviet state wrapped all in its path, and more young people were entranced with Soviet ideas and opportunities. Yet for many, a mistrust of the state still existed. By 1939, the Crimean Tatar population was under 20%, dwarfed by new Ukrainian and especially Russian immigration. The power and the danger of the Tatars seemed a thing of the past. And then the Second World War happened. The Second World War caught the Soviet Union off guard, and the suffering of its citizens is unfathomable. This played a large factor into the enmity between many Soviet citizens and the Crimean Tatars. In December of 1941, the Crimean Peninsula was occupied by Nazi German forces, with the exception of Sevastopol, which held out for longer. This occupation was met by a mixed reaction by many Crimean Tatars. One part of the population greeted the Germans with open arms, reminiscent of the welcome received in the First World War. This part of the population were quick to supply the invaders with information, resources, and even their loyalty. The Germans allowed the Muslim communities of Crimea to form Hueys, or auxiliary helper units, to help them police and maintain order in Crimea. The fact that so many Crimean Tatars did help the enemy at a time of extreme suffering would live long in Soviet memory. But this isn't to say that this was a popular or even widely taken choice. Many more Crimeans served in the Red Army, or operated guerrilla campaigns from the mountains in Crimea, depriving the invaders of rest and forcing them to keep at least some troops in the region. Nevertheless, the Tatars who helped the Germans made a more profound impact, and this is something that would doom the Crimean Tatar people when the region was retaken in 1944. On the 18th of May 1944, the entire Crimean Tatar population, around 191,000 people, were deported. Men, women, children, communists and collaborators, war heroes and babies were all collected and sent on inhumane carriages across the tracks into the desert. Thousands died of dehydration and cramped conditions en route to Central Asia. When they arrived, riots and pogroms awaited them, for the Crimean Tatars were deemed a traitorous nationality and outside legal protection in the Soviet law system. This has been largely recognized as a genocide, and the conditions inflicted upon them were on purpose. For many Soviet people, but especially those who had lived through the German occupation, the Crimean Tatars had committed an unthinkable sin, even apparently the little babies. This time is called the Surgun, or the exile, and estimates vary on how many died en route. With no support from the state, communities were founded and villages built as best they could, almost outside of the Soviet system. Banned from accessing anything positive from the state, the Crimean Tatars laboured and persisted in trying to get back home. In 1957, Khrushchev removed the special settler status that marked the Crimeans as traitors. but outright refused to allow them to return. This was for a number of reasons. Crimea was now a Slavic peninsula, with Ukrainians and Russians dominant. It was a productive and popular resort of the elite, the home of the powerful Black Sea Fleet, and there was no desire to repatriate people still largely seen as traitors. Whilst dumped in Uzbekistan and a small number in other parts of the Soviet Union, by 1957 the Crimean Tatars had made a surprisingly large economic impact. The Uzbek SSR was historically underdeveloped. It had always been hard to encourage people to move to these underdeveloped regions, and thus, by simply dumping populations there, the Soviet state gained access to a huge pool of workers to develop these regions, with the idea of one day attracting true Soviet people. Since 1944, Crimean Tatars had been attempting to return. The sheer distance alone made this hard, but coupled with the Soviet resistance, this was near enough impossible. In 1967, the Crimean Tatar nation were rehabilitated and official restrictions were removed. Despite this, bureaucracy was designed to keep the Crimeans away from Crimea, and thus barely anyone was able to get permission to go back to Crimea, many of those travelling illegally being deported or put in jail. A steady trickle of Crimeans began to return. These were few and far between, often lone men who had snuck back to Crimea by avoiding border guards and travelling off the beaten path. When they arrived, they found a land transformed. Gone were the squat Tatar villages, but now rising Soviet housing blocks, or dachas with painted fences and vast gardens. Unable to return to their homes, those who made the trip often eked out an existence far from Soviet eyes in the northern steppe. The last years of the Soviet regime actually saw great strides and progress for the Crimean Tatar people. As perestroika came into effect, protests and appeals began to be looked at seriously. Inter-ethnic violence in Uzbekistan gave the matter some gravity, and in 1989 an allowance to return to Crimea was agreed on in principle. The Soviet census of that year found there were already 40,000 Crimean Tatars living in the Ukrainian SSR, almost all of them in Crimea. Officially, they were still not allowed to return, but this principle of agreement was enough for some to attempt the journey anyway. Travelling back to Crimea was difficult for many reasons, and thus significant arrivals did not truly amount until the following year. That same year, the army were called to intervene, as rioting had broken out in southern Crimea, notably around the Altar, between the settled Slavic communities and the returning Crimeans. It had been 45 years since the end of the Second World War, but anti-Tatar propaganda had been circulating Crimea for a long time thereafter. Thus, to many residents of Crimea, the Tatars who were returning were not an exiled people, but rather a traitorous nation that had forfeited their land when they worked for the invader. The fall of the Soviet Union and the birth of modern Ukraine did not serve the Crimean Tatars especially well. Under Ukrainian law, upwards of 150,000 Crimean Tatars were entitled to Ukrainian citizenship, as their grandparents had been born on Ukrainian territory. However, this did not entitle them to any compensation from the state. Additionally, the bureaucracy involved was nightmarish, as it was still in post-Soviet shambles. Proper documentation was lengthy, costly, and incredibly frustrating to do. For those who were able to return, another hurdle was the land claims. Over 45,000 land claims were rejected in Ukraine between 1990 and 2001. This led to shanty villages and half-built homes erected on land as a legal way to prevent Ukrainian authorities moving the Crimeans on. Some Crimeans threw in the towel and relocated to the north where new villages were established. Whilst Crimea itself remained heavily Russian and the Tatar phobia was still evident to a degree, the Ukrainian state was far more ambivalent towards the Crimean Tatars, almost sympathetic. The Mejlis of Crimean Tatars, an official representative body, was created and registered with the state. This allowed a clear channel of communication between the Crimean Tatars and the Ukrainian government, particularly over land, housing and resources, all key Crimean issues. By 2004, Crimean Tatars made up 12% of the population of Crimea. Whilst the south was still heavily Russian, The north and central Crimean steppe was increasingly populated by Crimeans who had the money and incentive to return. A steady trickle of Crimean Tatars would arrive in Crimea throughout the first decade of the 2000s, as stability and economic incentives increased. Nonetheless, a significant portion of the Crimean Tatar population remained in Central Asia, either unable or unwilling to risk such a journey again. The Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 proved to be yet another blow for the Crimean Tatars. Despite initial support from the Russian Federation for Tatar rights, a campaign of harassment quickly was unveiled, and several thousand Crimean Tatars fled for the Ukrainian mainland. Through assassination, gerrymandering, and outright intimidation, the Little Green Men of Crimea reduced the Crimean Tatar population to a state of quiet obedience. This was because initially, many Crimean Tatars were hostile to the Russian takeover. Many Tatars did not cooperate with the Russian forces and even assisted Ukrainian intelligence in the early days of the annexation. By 2016, the Mejlis was banned as an anti-Russian nationalist agency, and several prominent members disappeared. Leaderless, crimes against Crimean Tatars went unpunished. In 2018, the United Nations received a 17,500-page document detailing numerous crimes Crimean Tatars had suffered under Russian rule: persecution, discrimination, torture, and outright murder. The state of Crimean Tatars in Crimea is an unusual one. Within Crimea, their language is still officially accepted, and on the surface level, they themselves are accepted as members of the Russian Federation. But behind this facade is a much darker state of affairs. Discrimination and terror face the Crimean Tatar community on a daily basis. When Russia invaded the Donbass region, numerous Crimean Tatar men received their enlistment letters. Some chose to flee abroad, others to fight, but the result was the same: a small population dwindling ever further. It is worth mentioning that some of this harassment is not necessarily state-orchestrated, but rather regionally orchestrated by anti-Tatar groups within Crimea. The majority of the population of Crimea are ethnically Russian, and have been since the post-war years. The land rights continue to be a source of contention, and many uppity Crimean Tatars find themselves disappeared, much to the relief of local politicians. Despite this, the Crimean Tatars are not a passive people. Many still advocate for land reforms, while others who have made it to the Ukrainian mainland serve in the armed forces of Ukraine. One way that Crimean Tatars have kept their unity throughout times of struggle and strife is via religion. The Crimean Tatars have been Muslim since the 14th century, and today boast a strong Islamic community, with polling finding 84% of Crimean Tatars adhering to Islam, almost entirely of the Sunni sect. Despite these land disputes, new mosques have actually been built, often backed by foreign sponsors. In fact, the foreign influence here in regards to religion is quite a curious one. Indigenous mullahs and imams were largely purged during the Soviet reign, and post-exile, most Islamic knowledge was half-remembered habits and customs. When the Crimean Tatars returned, many Gulf states sponsored new mosques and Islamic schooling, in no small part for geo-religious influence in the region. As was the case with the Chechen Republic, an infiltration of more radical Islamic sects and philosophies did seep in. Whilst Ukraine did take measures against this in the 2000s, the Russian annexation in 2014 served as the death knell for any extremist ideas coming from Crimea. As a Muslim people, most of the festivals and holidays that they celebrate follow the Islamic calendar. However, not all do. One widely celebrated festival is Hidrellez, an Islamic festival with origins in the Turkic spring rites. Additionally, Nowruz, the Persian New Year, is celebrated widely as well, a legacy from their time in Uzbekistan, a land with strong Persian influence. The traditional clothing of Crimean Tatars has a strong Turkish flavour. Worn on holidays and at weddings, men wear Turkish-style pantaloons, with a tight shirt called a kolyekse. Sandals, called nalin, are commonly worn in the summer, with winter boots for the colder seasons. Likewise, headgear changes with the seasons: a fez for the hot summer months, and a kalpak furred hat in the winter. Clothing for women is similar but with important differences. Women do actually wear trousers called duman and are designed to look like skirts. Apparently these emerged from a need for women to ride on horseback during the olden days of the Crimean Khanate. Long robes called chabulu anthur are very normal to see, often accompanied by a vest called a tonchuk or a jerkin called a salta marca. Embroidery was a highly prized skill in Crimea, and thus nearly all clothing bore elaborate stitching. Women in Crimea have worn fezzes since the 19th century, but today it is more common to see a marama headscarf or a shawl called a bashyavluk. An interesting note is that this clothing was never actually outlawed by the Soviet state nor by the Russian Empire before it. It had, however, been falling out of fashion since the 1900s, and today is only really seen at festivals and at weddings. In the same way that there is no one Crimean language, there is no real one Crimean cuisine. Crimean Tatar food is a hodgepodge, both influenced by different regions within Crimea, as well as the time in exile, as well as by the wider Russian influence. However, some popular dishes, chebureki, which is a fried pasty filled with lamb or beef, chorba, a meat stew, and burma, a vegetable pie. Whether eating a chebureki in the north or a burma dish from the south, both will be accompanied by pilau rice, a remnant from their time in Uzbekistan, and often followed by a form of baklava cake called shakerkiyit. The Crimean Tatars are a people under great pressure. Pressure from war, pressure for justice, and pressure from the modern world. Theirs is a long and tragic tale with no clear end in sight. That said, in all my research, one theme has currently come up, that of resilience. The Crimean Tatars for today are in a perilous situation, forced to survive in the modern world while still trying to find their place with roots in the past. It is hard to say what the situation for the Crimean Tatars will be like in 10 or even 50 years, as there is much uncertainty about their place both within Crimea and within the wider world. Thank you for watching. My name was Andrew. Up next are the Dargins. Paka!